Welcome, everybody. So glad you're here. My name is Stephen McCrocklin, and I'm the Executive Director at Langsford Learning Acceleration Centers, and also of WeTeachReading.com. So glad you're with us today. We're going to cover a number of things. And it's so important to understand that together we can make a huge difference in the lives of kids. I'm going to present to you today like I present to my own staff. I'm going to be bold, and together we're going to look around the corner and peer into the future of dyslexia and dyslexia remediation, and really the future of high-quality remediation. I'm going to push hard on some things, particularly toward the end, but I've always been focused on quality, instruction, and together we're going to look and see what that really looks like. To start, I would like us to meet an awesome young man, Brady, and rather than me talking about him, I'm going to have his mother do that.
So 7 years old, and loved learning, loved reading, loved everything that came along with it. But he worked so much harder than everybody else. And so our gut feeling just started to tell us that there was something was just not quite right, clicking. However, he was little, and it all seemed like we could write it off as something else. That he was maybe having a hard time staying focused, or that things were more interesting around him. We just started to realize that something was missing. And when he would read, he would look up to the sky, or he would look at the pictures. And it's almost like he was telling a story based on the pictures and not with the words that were in front of him. He would be able to look at the page and come up with words that were close enough that we were actually buying it, that he was reading, but he wasn't. He was able to still fool us and fool school. We just had a gut feeling that when he was reading, he wasn't reading the words. He wasn't actually seeing the letters as a word. He was seeing the pictures, and he was coming up with his own story. You know, why is he reading words that are in the sky, that are not the written word? He probably would have gotten through the rest of first grade that way. And maybe now into second grade is when we would have started realizing, hey, wait a minute, we've got a much bigger problem on our hands than we realize.
Something wasn't clicking. That was the kind of key part of what she said as she went on to describe that. And
so 7 years.
And the part that wasn't clicking was that he wasn't really able to decode the words. He wasn't able to look at those words and work through them. And he is not the first person to have that difficulty. So I'm going to read something to you, and this is from a medical journal that was written on November 7th in 1890 by Pringle Morgan. This is the person you're seeing there in that chair. And here's what he wrote. He said, Percy F., a well-grown lad, age 14, is the eldest son of intelligent parents, the second child of a family of 7. He has always been a bright and intelligent boy, quick at games, and in no way inferior to others his age. His great difficulty has been, and is now, his inability to learn to read. This inability is so remarkable and so pronounced that I have no doubt it is due to some congenital defect. He has been at school under tutors since he was age 7, and the greatest efforts have been made to teach him to read. But in spite of this laborious and persistent training, he can only with great difficulty spell words of only one syllable. He knows all of his letters, and he can write them and read them. In writing from dictation, he comes to grief over any but the simplest word. He says he's fond of arithmetic and finds no difficulty with it, but that the printed written words have, quote, no meaning to him, and my examination of him quite convinces me that he is correct in his opinion. The schoolmaster who taught him for some years says that he would be the smartest lad in the school if the instruction were entirely oral. And that again was in 1890, that again was in 1896. So the background of dyslexia is actually a whole separate presentation that's very, very interesting. But we're just going to zip through to present by saying that what we understand now from that first description is now that it is language, specifically speech, that's critical to the development of reading. And within language, it is really phonemic awareness that is most predictive and most important in that development of reading. So what's phonemic awareness? So if we look at the language system, this area of phonology is below discourse, below syntax, below semantics is where phonology lives. And this is a deep language process that refers to the individual sounds that make up spoken words. It's not phonics. It does not involve print or letters at all.
The brain comes equipped to say a word without having to have conscious awareness of each individual sound. But when you're going to use the alphabet principle and code that word with letters, then you do have to have conscious awareness of the sounds.
You can learn to talk relatively well without becoming that phonologically aware, without really needing to break the sounds down in your mind. It's only when you hit reading that you must become aware that words are made up of smaller units.
We know that it takes initially a clear understanding that the language we hear is composed of smaller sounds. These are called phonemes, smallest unit of sound. And people say, sure, cat has 3 sounds, cat. And I could ask people all the time how many sounds they hear in big or cat, and they'll say 3, cat, big. But they don't. You don't hear 3 sounds in cat. I don't hear 3 sounds in cat. Our kids never get any practice with the sounds in cat because nature has given us an oral language that allows us to communicate rapidly, so that when I say cat, I don't say cat. What the hell is a cat? What I say is cat. The minute I start to say cat, the a and the sound co-articulate or bundle together and come by the ear as one pulse of sound. Phoneme awareness is much more difficult because you don't hear the sounds. And the brain has to pull from that one verbal or acoustic bundle the 3 sounds, because the ear won't. The ear never hears the individual sounds unless we spell them out.
Children may have implicit experiences with phonemic awareness when their parents read nursery rhymes to them. And so Peter Bryant, for example, has argued that nursery rhymes are the genesis of phonemic awareness. That's the beginning place that children might naturally begin to shift to language play. And certainly doing Pig Latin, for example, might be something that you would naturally play with language, but not many children necessarily do that. And so we have to provide those specific experiences for the children so that when they go to school, they'll be ready to begin to break the code.
So that's a key piece. So what exactly is dyslexia, and is there a definition for it? And there is, in fact. The first definition was put forth in 1994, and then that was updated and revised in 2002. And then in 2016, a team of well-known researchers convened and looked at that definition again, and they concluded that there was no compelling reason to change the definition. So we've got this static, pretty solid definition of what dyslexia is. So what is it? Let's look at that. Here it is, and I'll read it. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurobiological in origin. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in those phonological components of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension, reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So that's a mouthful. Let's take that a piece at a time because it's actually not so involved. So when we say that dyslexia is a specific learning disability, what we mean by that is it's not a catch-all term, that it is a specific disability and it's one among others. And so that way we get it in the hierarchy of disabilities so that kids can get meaningful instruction. Next is that it's neurobiological in origin. And that means it's that a person's brain is wired differently, that it doesn't happen in the ears or the eyes, and it's not caused by poverty, developmental delays, or learning English as a second language. And that it really is a breakdown in the brain at the level of neuronal activity. And that's key. And notice that it's specifically not talked about in the eyes or a visual problem. We'll get back to that in a minute. The slides are jumping ahead on me. And it's characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling abilities, which means that this breakdown happens at the single word level. That there's this difficulty being able to spell out a single word or to read a single word, separate from context and pictures on the page, just that ability to work well with single words. And being able to do that with a level of ease and fluency. And that would be that slide. And then, again, it points to this idea next that it is typically the result of a deficit in those phonological components of language. And so back to that language ladder that we looked at just a bit ago, and that is below this level of discourse, syntax, and semantics is that phonology area. And it's that phonology area that plugs in and gives the ability to decode words. So without that intact phonology, a person doesn't develop the tools they need to work and sound through words, sound out words to reading and spelling, if they don't have that phonology in place. So that's where the disconnect is there. That's the underlying difficulty. And that this difficulty is unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So certainly, just because someone has a developmental delay doesn't mean that they don't have dyslexia. So we're looking at, and so this is characterized again by this person who has some good cognitive abilities in some areas, and yet there's this unexpected weakness in these other areas that we're looking at. And this happens in the provision of effective classroom instruction. So certainly a person who's not been exposed to reading instruction who can't read would not be counted as dyslexic. And the consequences of this, what we talk about as the secondary consequences, is that a person has difficulty in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth in vocabulary and background knowledge. So simply said, if you can't decode a word, you then have limited access to meaning. And if you don't read, the vocabulary and background knowledge necessary for efficient comprehension may not develop. So someone with a comprehension problem in and of itself does not indicate dyslexia, but if you can't read well, it can get in the way of your ability to comprehend what you read, to develop the background experience and vocabulary. In real life, this can look a lot like an iceberg. And so there may be this student you see who's having trouble with writing, or they're perhaps not a great speller, or they're not necessarily super accurate when they read, but it's all the stuff below that that's super key. When you start to dig into that, which is not apparent on the surface, you realize that they really do have difficulty with accurate word recognition, that they have difficulty sounding out new words, ones that they haven't seen before, to read them or spell them. And that even deeper than that are these underpinning phonological processes that aren't in place, like phonemic awareness we talked about, rapid or phonological memory, which is necessary to have good phonemic awareness, as is some processing speeds related to reading that we talk about as rapid symbolic naming. So that's to say that what you might see on the surface is an indicator of some much deeper pieces not being in place. So that's the definition, and that's widely accepted. We'll get into that in a minute. or actually right now. So many states have recognized the importance of this information and have gone on to pass dyslexia laws. And actually, we have all but 3 states in our nation that don't actually have legislation around dyslexia. Kentucky, for example, started a dyslexia law in 2012, and then in 2018 added to that and actually matched that definition up with the definition we just read, which was put forth by the National Institute of Health and other leading national organizations. And as you can see here, if you were to read that, it is exactly that same definition. And many states have matched up exactly to that. Even more, this is a diagnostic criteria. So if you're a psychologist and you've evaluated a child and then they meet this criteria, this is a valid definition or a diagnosis articulated in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And they say dyslexia is an alternative term used to refer to a pattern of learning difficulties characterized by problems with accurate and or fluent word recognition, poor decoding, and poor spelling abilities. So they really have matched up pretty closely to that same definition. A lot of people are not also clear that under disability law, dyslexia is also recognized. So disability laws, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and this is a law that makes available a free and appropriate public education to eligible children with disabilities throughout the nation to ensure that special education-related services reach those children. And dyslexia is a criteria that is accepted under that. Also, most recently, First Steps Act in 2018, and this is a criminal justice reform act that provides programs to help reduce recidivism in the prison population, so that that the reading needs will be identified and ideally addressed, so that they don't just return to prison because they're illiterate and struggle finding a job because of the literacy demands. And so here again is another branch of our federal government that has identified dyslexia, and they say that this means an unexpected difficulty in reading for an individual who has intelligence to be a much better reader, most commonly caused by a difficulty in the phonological processes of language. So you can see here that there's a clear theme that there is a definition for dyslexia. It's widely accepted. It's absolutely accepted by the research community as well as branches of the federal government and diagnosing. So this is really key, because if we don't agree on a definition, then it impedes our ability to move forward and actually reach and help kids. So now that we have a definition, what is it that causes dyslexia? So what's different in the brain, and how do we know this? Well, to know this, we have to leave the field of education and we need to go to the world of brain science. And the video I'm going to show you is just one example of what's going on in one lab that happens to be at the University of California, San Francisco. But this kind of work is going on all over the world. Yale, Georgetown, University of Colorado, Bowman Gray, Neurospin in France, just to name a few. And it's deeply impressive work.
In the last decade, we've learned from the MRI that dyslexia really comes from the brain, and technology now is such a high level that we can look at really high resolution of how the brain functions and how it looks, and we have great people, engineers, who spend their life using this technology. The resolution is so high that we can look at millimeters in the brain, and we weren't able to do that before. We have the computer power to analyze thousands of images all together, to look at connections between brain areas that we weren't able to look at before. So I think it's a really exciting time. It's not just to look at the difficulties of the dyslexic brain, but we can really help kids and adults look at their strengths. We can look at the neural mechanism of how they do things differently at the individual level. As a neurologist and a cognitive scientist, I think it's just really exciting that we finally have the technology to do what we need to do to understand dyslexia better.
pretty neat stuff. So I want to touch on a couple key parts. Most important is that we now understand that there's a universal brain signature of skilled reading. So there are areas of the brain that are involved with reading. Now, this view is simplistic, but it's very accurate. And so what's important to understand is that all over the world, the same brain regions activate to read the written word. And this tells us that good readers go about reading the same way, not uniquely different ways. But these areas are not designed to be areas of reading. Reading is not a natural process, it's a cultural invention. So certain brain circuits remain open to changes in the environment and are able to adapt by turning this predisposition to a different use, but they're imperfect. And it really is only through years of practice that many of us become under the illusion that reading is this simple and effortless thing. So we can see here that these are key brain regions that are necessary and become active when we learn to read. And when we look at the brains of people who have dyslexia, we find that there's a very different activation plan. We find that people have an overactivation of this sort of frontal area and a significant underactivation of the posterior areas of the brain. And so when we look at that, just one thing of many, many things we've learned is that in those areas of the brains of people with dyslexia, there are a bunch of out-of-line neurons. These are called ectopias. So I've highlighted those areas. And what happens when we look under an electron microscope at these parts of the brain is that we can see that when the outer layer of the brain was built out at about 6 months of gestation, that the neurons that were supposed to stop in this area don't. They breach that area and go up to these outer layers. And the consequence of that is when it comes time to learn to read and wire these areas, these neurons aren't where they need to be easily wired. So that's just one example of some of what the science has told us about reading. So let me address one thing. This is an email we got recently from a teacher. It said, this is a teacher of an elementary age student that we're in contact with. And he said, I've spoken with our counselor about the possibility of Helen being dyslexic. She struggles to remember which is the correct way for letters, words, and numbers to go. She also writes whole words backwards. She seems to have a consistent underlying understanding of directionality. I know this is challenging to diagnose at this age because there's a natural tendency to write things backwards. Just something I would like you to keep an eye on. And so this goes to this question of, does dyslexia mean seeing and writing letters backwards? And in fact, backwards writing and reversals of letters and words is common in the early stages of writing development among dyslexic and non-dyslexic children. But these beliefs about dyslexia are so prevalent that many dyslexic children who don't make reversals are often undiagnosed. So dyslexic children have problems in some areas, but reversing is not a core one. So no, in fact, being dyslexic does not mean seeing letters and writing letters and words backwards. It's not a visual problem. We do know, though, that reversals are the consequence of less reading experience. So these are difficulties that people who are not skilled readers make. So what are signs of dyslexia? Let's be real clear on what it is that someone who has dyslexia might do so you can become better at recognizing it. For one, there's this difficulty understanding the connection between sounds and letters. And they don't understand that words come apart. And they have a hard time reading or in fact dislike reading enough to where when it's reading time, they might just flat out disappear. And they'll talk about reading being difficulty. We also know that many kids, when you look into that, it starts to reveal that there might be a history of reading problems in the family. But it goes to this core underpinning that they have trouble sounding out words that you might have gone over and over. They might have memorized them, or you might have worked with them on one page and they turn to the next page and they struggle with that same word again. And so they're really not associating the letters and sounds in the way that they need to. Second grade and up, you'll notice that there's just difficulty in acquiring and becoming proficient at sounding out words. So they come to that unfamiliar word and they just don't have a way to work through it well. And you might see their eyes start to move all over the page. You might see them skip to the words ahead, skip to the words behind, and even scan up at the picture to try to make a better guess of what it is. And that's all the things that someone would do if they can't sound the word out. And then, of course, because it's difficult, they don't enjoy it. So often a student will avoid, just not like to read, or just avoid trying to read altogether. So when that happens, when anyone's having difficulty with reading, it's very important to get a plan. And this is especially important if you see the signs that we just talked about. Time matters. Kids rarely outgrow these difficulties. In fact, the American Federation of Teachers wrote a great article about this titled, "Waiting Rarely Works, Late Bloomers Usually Just Wilt." So the idea of just waiting for things to click is not really a good plan. So what is a good plan? Well, the first step is identification. And the challenge right now is, despite having good definitions and really good science, getting a good diagnosis or getting this properly identified can still be a problem. And that's because dyslexia, back to the iceberg, right? Dyslexia affects many areas. But some examiners and some tests just look at one. And so they find one weakness and come to the wrong conclusion. They don't realize that one weakness may be part of a bigger weakness. And that goes to say something that you're going to hear me say as we keep going, that dyslexia is not a single layer problem. And it really reminds me so often of the fable of the blind men who approach an elephant from different directions. And so one blind man discovers the trunk and describes the animal very differently than one who finds the tail of the elephant next, or the leg or the tusk. Each one is describing this different thing, and yet none of them actually see that what they found was part of a bigger thing, that being an elephant. And we see this very often, where we'll see a student who's been diagnosed with a spelling problem or a fluency problem or an auditory processing or dysgraphia or a written language disorder. And yet, when you look at that on the whole, you realize that the pattern of scores across all of these key areas is consistent with dyslexia. So that's to say that to identify dyslexia, it takes proper understanding of what it is, and it's not diagnosed by one test. It's not a single layer problem. It takes multiple tests and someone who's really experienced in understanding and measuring this in order to get a proper diagnosis. So it's not a test that diagnoses. It's a person, and an experienced person with knowledge of what dyslexia is and isn't. We get guidance on how to do that from certainly the science, but that's been translated in a nice article put forth by the International Dyslexia Association. And that includes some of these: background information about the family, about the child, so, a measure of word recognition, decoding, spelling, phonemic awareness, automaticity and fluency, vocabulary knowledge, reading and listening comprehension, oral language skills. All these pieces need to be looked at together to really understand, and look at that pattern of scores.
Once we got all those pieces of the puzzle, and we could kind of start seeing how they all worked together,
right,
it just made so much more sense.
Yes.
And then it was like we could see Brady almost through new eyes. We could understand a little more what was happening in his mind, because his mind is incredible. I feel blessed to even know him and his mind.
And so again, that was obviously Brady's mother, and talking about what it was like for her when she finally had that whole picture come together. It's important to understand that intelligence, nowhere along the way have we talked about intelligence, and there's no regulation that requires there to be a discrepancy between an IQ and achievement score to make a diagnosis of dyslexia. That's not required. So science can guide the plan. So I said we need a plan, and that plan starts with identifying what's going on. And then from there, we can start to put a plan of action together. So the science can guide us on what is helpful and what needs to be done, and almost as important is what not to do. So now that we know this is dyslexia, there are things we know that don't help. And we want to avoid these things because they will pull precious time and resources away from what does work. So let's cover a few things that the science tells us that we know don't help people who have dyslexia. One of them is vision therapy, eye tracking practice, and colored lenses. And so there was a joint statement written by the American Academy of Pediatrics that you're seeing in this slide. And there are a number of different groups: the American Academy of Pediatrics, ophthalmology, the American Academy of Ophthalmology, the American Association for Pediatric Ophthalmology, and Strabismus, all came together and wrote a document. And here's one of the key parts of it. It says, vision problems can interfere with the process of learning. However, vision problems are not the cause of primary dyslexia or learning disabilities. Scientific evidence does not support the efficacy of eye exercises, behavioral vision therapy, specially tinted filters or lenses for improving long-term educational performance in these complex pediatric neurological conditions. We desperately wish that if all that was necessary to correct dyslexia was about colored lenses or eye exercises, that would work. But randomized controlled large-scale studies show us that they don't. And as a matter of fact, for that to be the case, it means that the problem is in the eyes. And we know for sure from the science that it's not in the eyes, that it's in that deeper level of language that we talked about based in phonology. What else? Special fonts don't help. And so we were super interested in how this would pan out, but the data is very clear that that just by changing the font that someone sees doesn't make them a better reader. And so children with dyslexia did not read text written in dyslexia font faster or more accurate than they did in Arial. And moreover, participants showed a preference for the font Arial and Times New Roman rather than dyslexia. Dyslexia font neither benefited nor impeded the reading process of children with and without dyslexia. It just doesn't make a difference. And why? Well, we already talked about that. Why? Because the breakdown isn't in the visual system, it's in that deep language system. So what about special movements? Proponents suggest that repeating specific movements or physical exercise would normalize the brain function of a person with dyslexia, enabling them to learn to read more easily. And again, we wish that doing some kind of physical movement would retrain the brain to do these things, but it's not. Those physical movements aren't training the brain in the area where the brain needs to be trained. The brain needs to be trained in these deep language circuits, not the cerebellum or other areas that are involved in motion. And so what we do know for sure is that exercise that increases blood flow does improve learning. So certainly classrooms that get up and move around or are physical exercise helps learning, but that's not specific to just reading. So here's another one. Ear reading, and this is something that we can hear more and more about. And ear reading is this idea of, what if I listen to the audio version of the book? So the question then is, how well do students perform if they just say, let's not worry about the student reading the material, let's just have the student listen to it and see how they perform. So there have been some interesting studies on this. And so the question is, how does a student learn from a 22-minute podcast versus print on a test 2 days later? And so, not well, sadly. The students who took the test who read in print performed an 81% on the test. However, the students that listened to the podcast of that same information scored a 59, which is below a failing grade. And so there's a difference between the kinds of things that people like to listen to on audiobooks versus reading. So audiobooks, and you'll find that when people listen to books, it tends to be more pleasure reading, and it tends to be along with something else, sort of happening at the same time. Like they're multitasking, they're mowing their yard, they're driving somewhere, listening to a book, and that's a very different thing. So when there's subject matter that's novel, that's difficult, not pleasure reading, but complicated subject matter, it's harder. People who read that do much better. And so when we look at that, when we do eye tracking studies and we really unpack what is a skilled reader doing when they read, we understand that they have a level of focus, that they slow down at key points, they may stop in the middle, they may jump back and look at an idea on a previous page, they'll stop and think, and they're assimilating all these ideas. It's not a consistent input of data. And print has signals that are important. There are paragraph headers, there are subject headings, there are diagrams. All these things together help us significantly in understanding print. Also, this whole idea of reading, the more we understand the science of it, the more we realize that it is truly like a cognitive upgrade, that it's a technological add-on that extends our capacity of bringing language in beyond their natural limits. Text, as we read it, it doesn't fade. As you hear something, those words are gone after you hear them. The text is still there. The reader controls the pace of information, and most importantly, a skilled reader can read at speeds that vastly exceed the speed that of speech and the speed at which we can listen. So I want to touch on this idea that dyslexia runs through families, and it runs through mine. And candidly, that's how Langsford was formed in the first place, so that other kids don't have to go through what I went through in learning to read at school. And in the process of this, parents often ask me, and you'll see in news groups on dyslexia, isn't dyslexia a gift? Well, frankly, that's a tough one. I really would like to believe it's a gift, and I suppose in many ways it taught me what it was like to have to work hard, because I had to work hard through school. I was lucky, and I didn't give up, and I completed a 4-year college degree at a very competitive college, and I did that in 4 years, and I got a great education, and I'm very passionate about what I do, but there's this growing trend to think that by virtue of having dyslexia, that you're automatically gifted in other areas. And so, then again, or back to this idea is dyslexia a gift? And the truth is, if you look at the data and you look at people's personal experiences, it's very tough to say it's a gift. If you ask people who are in prison where illiteracy is very high, they don't find that as a gift, and we have done that work. If you talk to some of the parents or students of the 40% of fourth graders nationwide who are below basic levels of reading, you're hard-pressed to find someone say that that's a gift. And in truth, if you look at it, we don't have any scientific evidence that being dyslexic is a direct cause of giftedness or expertise in any way. What research does show us is that strengths are made, and they're made by a person's hard work, persistent practice, and intense drive to excel. So dyslexia alone does not make or give a person strengths. In fact, at some level it is disabling. And so really the ultimate question is, when a person, what does the person ultimately choose to do when something's difficult, whether that's reading or some other area in their life? And ideally, there's internal grit and resilience, and that there are a lot of people around that student that help them launch. And I'm a strong believer in that idea that we have to help kids flip what dyslexia is for them. And this is a poem written by a dyslexic student that has moved me greatly. And it says this, and I'll read it for you. It might be hard to see on the slide. It says, "Dyslexia. I am stupid. No one would ever say that I have a talent for words. I was meant to be great. That is wrong. I am a failure. No one would ever convince me to think that I can make it in life." But here's the flipped part. Now read that poem from the bottom up. It says, "I can make it in life. No one could ever convince me to think that I'm a failure. That is wrong. I was meant to be great. I have a talent for words. No one would ever say I'm stupid." Dyslexia. And that's what it is. So dyslexia is not an inherent gift. However, we can flip it to be that. And we can support kids and help them get the tools that they need to be successful and to feel good about themselves and develop grit, resiliency, and perseverance. But that is something we need to bolster in kids. So let's check back in on Brady. So this should be easy, right? Well, here's the challenge. Dyslexia is not a single layer problem, and the majority of children with dyslexia meet the criteria for at least one other challenge. So thus, co-occurring difficulties is the rule rather than the exception for dyslexia, and this must be considered during assessment and diagnosis. Here's his mother.
He has ADHD. Oh, he has combined and inattentive ADHD at that. I'm sorry, he actually can't read anything. Okay. We were talking single digits of being able to read. And he has a 5% working memory. So all of those things are against this child. And so that's, that's three major things against this kid.
So again, back to assessment, we have to look at all these parts. And this just shows that dyslexia likes company, and that's how I often think about it, is that dyslexia rarely likes to be alone. It likes to bring its friends along with it. And this is a graph of some of the company that dyslexia will take. A couple of key things, though. As I said, dyslexia runs through families. There's a 40 to 60% chance of developing dyslexia if a parent has it. It increases when other family members have it as well. The prevalence of dyslexia is somewhere between 5 and 12%, and 15 to 20% have some symptoms of it. So at some level, we have to make a decision of where exactly we drop the line in terms of having dyslexia and not. So depending on exactly how you define or where you drop that line, it can be at that 12% mark, and then above that are symptoms, but we wouldn't call that full-fledged dyslexia. But again, it runs through families is the point of this slide. Okay, so now we know we have dyslexia. We know it can have company. We know that it's not a single layer problem. So what do you do now? Very often, the first line of action is what we call accommodations and modifications. And these are good things. I mean, we want kids to get some extra support that helps them in school. So an accommodation is something where we keep the bar just as high. We expect them to do the work that other people do, but they might get preferential seating. They might be able to take that same test in another room. And a variety of things. A modification is where we actually start to lower the bar. That might be that a student has different spelling words or fewer spelling words. Maybe they don't have to write as much on a paper. They have a much greater amount of time, perhaps, to finish a test. But as you can see, these are things that are kind of working around the problem. What's most important is on getting to the underlying pieces and train that up. But that kind of training is time-consuming and requires special training to do, and that's what remediation is. Well, what's tutoring? So, in terms of tutoring, a lot of kids go to tutoring. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem in the end is it doesn't ask the fundamental question of why do they need tutoring in the first place? Like, what is the underlying problem that they need that help? And really the assumption is in tutoring that there's an external problem, like, I don't know, they miss some school or they have a bad teacher or, they just need a little more of what is going on in the classroom to get them going. And with that sort of extra bit of more, that they'll develop mastery. But when a student has dyslexia, that's not what happens. So the deeper question is, again, what's not in place that if it already were, the student would be more independent? So when we start looking at remediation, you'll often hear about the Orton-Gillingham method. And the Orton-Gillingham method was developed by Samuel T. Orton, who was born in 1879, and he was an American physician and really pioneered some of the study of learning disability. And Anna Gillingham, who was born in 1878, she was an educator and psychologist, and she worked with Dr. Orton, and she trained teachers and published instructional material. And in particular, she worked with Bessie Stillman and wrote what became the Orton-Gillingham Manual, which is their remedial training for children with specific disabilities in reading, spelling, and penmanship. And that was published in 1935. And from that tradition, that's been the basis for a whole series of reading programs. But what's common to them all is the use of a structured phonics piece. These are often single-layer programs, and one of the ones that many people might be familiar with, and is certainly continuing to grow in popularity, is one called the Barton Reading System. And this is one that was designed originally for parents who wanted to tutor their children or volunteer tutors in school, but a lot of people use it as well, and including professional tutors. It is often taught one-to-one. It's intended to be. It's often done twice a week, usually for an hour or so. And if a student has sort of classic or moderate dyslexia, that's about a 2 to 3 year program, somewhere around 300 or so hours. And students with more severe dyslexia may need 4 to 5 years, and that's somewhere around 520 hours of work. And let me show you a little bit of what that looks like. Now, in our mind, that's a long time to go through an intervention. So let's look at what a typical sort of structured phonics program looks like.
So you're very good at hearing each and every sound in a word. So today, you're going to learn which letters go with those sounds. Then we'll practice reading and spelling with those letters. But as you know, there are lots of letters in our alphabet. I'm not going to use all of them today. Today, I will only use the 7 most common letters. Ready for the first one?
Sure.
Tell me the name of this letter.
A.
Right, and the letter A is a vowel. Vowels are the most important letters because every word must contain a vowel, and every syllable within a word as well. Yet vowels can be tricky because they can make several different sounds. For now, this vowel will only make the most common sound, which is A. Repeat the sound.
A.
Good sound. Now I'm going to have you create a picture in your head to help you remember that sound. It's easiest to create a picture with your eyes closed, so go ahead and close your eyes. In your mind, I'd like you to picture the front of your favorite grocery store. Can you see it?
Yes.
Now picture yourself walking through the doors into the grocery store. Can you feel the nice, cool air?
Okay, so that's actually a clip off YouTube. You can find that if you look for it. But I want you to think about that in some depth. Who is doing most of the talking? And it turns out that we understand that whoever's doing the talking is doing most of the thinking. How strong does the student's language processing have to be? And what about a student who might have a really small working memory, like Brady, who's at a 5th percentile, as his mother said? How strong do you have to be at processing language and holding language to be able to start to understand that lesson? How much reliance is there on memory versus understanding? And I think many of us can understand that you might be able to memorize something you don't understand. So just by virtue of memorizing something doesn't mean you really understand it. What is the instructor focused on? And I think when you think about this, you'll think about the idea that the instructor is really focused on implementing a program. She's reading this document, and the whole goal is to do this program with fidelity. And so it's not really focused on the student as much as it is focused on implementing this sort of narrative that she's got in front of her. Does the lesson wrap around the student, or does the student have to come to the lesson? How much differentiation is possible? Can you really dive into the specific parts that a specific child needs? Oh, and what about one with maybe a low working memory or low language processing problems? And so this really reminds me a lot of anyone who's had the experience of calling technical support with a computer problem. And the person on technical support is following a flow chart. And so you call the person, you say, hey, I've had this problem with my computer, and you can rattle off all the stuff you've done, but then what happens is the person goes back to the top of the flow chart and says, have you, do you have warranty first? And then, have you restarted your computer? When you restarted it, and so they walk you through this very set formula, this very set flow chart that you have to pretty much drop everything you've done and go to that formula. And the problem is that it's very restrictive. And so the next level of instruction and the next continuum of progress, sort of next generation instruction, is this. It's not scripted, it's open-ended. So you might start a lesson by saying, tell me everything you know about the letter C. What do you understand about how the letter C works in a word? And then based upon what they say, you then respond to their response so that you're matching where they are. You don't just read off a bunch of stuff about the letter C expecting them to memorize it or repeat it, but rather your goal is to understand what they know, and then you fill in the rest that they do. And you do that in a way that's not memory-based. You do that through a guided discovery. It's also really important to understand that the reading difficulties that kids have are not necessarily based at phonics problems. And so this is what you saw. There was a pretty single-layer program, not one that's comprehensive, that understands the whole of the reading process and that custom builds the parts for that student that they need, and then not covering the areas that they don't need. Meaningful instruction can be done in weeks, not years. It's not necessary to spend 300 to 500 hours in working through the difficulties that someone with dyslexia has. This can be done in literally weeks. And that the fidelity then shifts from implementing a program with fidelity to working with a student directly one-on-one. And so it matters what the child understands, not necessarily what you've introduced to the child. So just by virtue of you having said something doesn't mean that child understands it. So when your focus is on program fidelity, that's about making sure you said it. When you're really focusing on what the child understands, you're then setting a situation up where a student discovers what they need to understand, and they can language it out and they really understand it. And then again, this idea that effective remediation is not single layer, it's really comprehensive. And so the effective remediation moves away from sort of a single layer boxed program to something that's comprehensive and built for that student. So we can talk about that more and more as structured literacy, but really the next generation of instruction beyond what you're hearing now, sort of the buzzwords around structured literacy, is something that's comprehensively built for that student, because you can get much more done much more effectively in a significantly less amount of time. So what are the key features of these pieces? That means that next generation approaches are assessment driven. You custom build a program based upon their constellation of scores. The lessons are adjusted and based on their child's working memory, their processing speed, whether or not they have ADHD or anxiety or OCD. All these things can be controlled for in learning sessions. That the instructional methodology and approaches is guided by the scientifically based reading research. We know what things are effective and what's not. Things that are not scripted. We want to move beyond scripts and go to a respond to the response. If we're having an event here at Langsford and there are 100 people on the way and they all get lost, they're not all lost in the same place. You can't just tell everyone, who's lost the very same direction. You have to customize it based upon where they are. So the first thing you're going to ask is, where are you stuck or where are you lost? And then based upon what they say, you're going to give them a different response than perhaps someone else who's lost. And that's what we mean by not scripted, but authentic. That it's a guided discovery, that it's not memory-based, that the questions are scaffolded. Each question builds upon the one before. That the whole goal is metacognitive development, meaning that you're trying to help a student think about how they think, that they become an independent learner, not that they're just memorizing. And that we also know what musicians and athletes have always understood, and that is that if you want to get good at something, you have to do it every day. It's very hard to become a competitive marathon runner if you're only running once or twice a week for an hour. The same thing true if you want to learn to play the piano and you're only practicing the piano a day or two a week, you're not going to get there. But if you're practicing the piano every day, you're going to become a pretty proficient pianist. And so the challenge is these are hard to do in a school setting. We understand that that it requires a deeper level of immersement and customization than what's typically able to happen at a school, and that there's lots of training and collaboration involved in doing this kind of deeper work well. We also know that it's time sensitive, meaning we don't have years and years to get kids where they need to get. If you take a student who's struggling in second grade with reading and you spend 3 or more years to get there, they're going to be behind in everything else. So we just don't have years to do that. But most importantly, that the investment needs to go into staff development. It's not about buying materials. It's not about fancy boxes or kits and DVDs and worksheets and workbooks. That's not the place to put the investment. The place to put the investment is in the instruction and training of the instructor, so that they really understand how to work well without a script. And then that's, again, best done collaboratively, where there's more than one person who's working with that student who understands that student's needs and can collaborate. Just like any successful project, high quality, meaningful projects are not done by one person all alone. They're done by a team of effective people. And so if we look at that, if we look at so many of the programs that today are being used to teach kids with dyslexia, again, they are based on programs that were developed in the 1930s. And this is a car that was built and worked in the 1930s. And you would not drive this car from the 1930s across town if you really need to get there in a safe and effective way. So why would you want to educate your child using the same kind of technology? This is an example of a completely reimagined vehicle. Now, I'm not a proponent of Tesla specifically, though I think they're cool cars, but the point is that when it's time to make the next generation of cars, it was reimagined. Everything about the car was rethought. And the consequence of that is you have a whole next generation automobile. So I want to just hammer on this idea one last time, that reading is truly a brain enhancement, and that the more the right support is delayed, the harder it is to get caught up. Remediation should be soon, it should be swift, so that the student can get on with the joy of reading. Otherwise, the student starts to get behind in their spelling and their writing and their vocabulary and their background experience, and goes on to dislike reading in school. It's just so hard to catch up. So we really want to try to make the biggest impact that we can as soon as we can, pinpoint the difficulties. We want to target the instruction and make the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time that we can, so that they can close the gap and get on with their peers in reading. Back to awesome Brady here. Brady did 14 weeks of work, which turns out to be about 140 hours, and at the end, he was just completely blown away by his gains. He went again from effectively a non-reader to being above benchmark. His grade equivalent of reading was 3.5 grade level. His percent rank was 86th. His estimated oral reading fluency is 100 words per minute. And you can see, he's solidly here at this at and above benchmark on the STAR diagnostic test. On the MAP test, also, he exceeded grade level expectations, and his instructional level of reading was between a 450 and 550. So he really, and these are tests outside of Langsford, these are tests that happened at school. He just really blew it away and really made the trip that he needed to make on his own. So here's a picture of Brady at the end, his certificate of achievement of the excellent work he did, sitting here with his sister reading in some of the books that he was mowing through at the end of his work.
He loves to read. So at any part of the day, you will find Brady and he'll have a book and he'll do exactly that. He'll, curl up on the couch and he'll read. And now that he has those skills to pull apart a word and put it back together without, breaking into a sweat because it's so hard to do that.
Right.
Now that he can do that, the sky's the limit for him. It really is fun. And this is coming from a point where we were in tears. We were literally crying. We were so heartbroken for him. And now it's amazing. His potential is finally matching up with what we knew was there. We could tell it was there. We just needed to help him unlock it. I could not be more proud of him.
An amazing, amazing young man. As we wind down, I just wanted to say that if you want Langsford's help in guiding your child to confident reading, we would love to help you. It's simple. Just call, schedule an evaluation, and we can meet about the plan. There's no obligation beyond that at all. If you want one of our targeted instructional plans that leads to lasting success, we'd love to help you with that too. If we can be of any help, feel free to reach out. Here's our contact information for our team. Again, my name is Stephen McCrocklin. I'm the Executive Director here at Langsford Learning Acceleration Centers and WeTeachReading.com. We have a great website at WeTeachReading.com. You can do WeTeachReading.com/dyslexia and get to the dyslexia part on our webpage. And there are blogs and other pieces that are helpful. You can reach our team at info@WeTeachReading.com. You can also call us. We'd be happy to talk with you and help you however we can, 502-473-7000. Thank you so much for your time today. It's an honor to be able to talk about this topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of any help. Thank you so much and have a great day.